Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I am Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation. Today is February 23rd, 2023, and I am delighted to be here with Rabea Eghbariah, one of FMEP's 2023 Palestinian Non-Resident Fellows. Today is our first official podcast together with you as a fellow, Rabea, and I am so glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
So I want to start by introducing you to our audience, a little formally, and then we'll unpack. So Rabea is a human rights attorney completing his doctoral studies at Harvard Law School. He worked as an appellate public defender before joining the Haifa-based Adela Legal Center, where he argued major Palestinian civil and political rights cases. And I'll just add that Adela is a partner of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.
Correct.
A partnership we're very proud of. Rabea published on various subjects relating to Palestinians and Israeli law, including the censorship of online speech, the legal land regime, and the criminalization of Palestinian foragers. His writings appeared in the Yale Journal of Law and Technology, the Law and Political Economy Project, and the Journal of Palestine Studies, among others. Rabea previously served as an executive article editor of the Harvard Human Rights Journal and currently serves as an editorial member of Jadaliya's Palestine page. And he has a brand new article together with Nora Erekat on Jadaliya.
That's right.
We'll have a link on the webpage for this podcast. It's excellent. So Rabea, my first question for you, not in the language of your professional biography, will you please tell our audience about yourself? Who are you? What do you want listeners to know about you as a scholar, as a human rights attorney, as a person?
Yeah, I'm so excited first to be here with you and have this conversation. I just remembered when I first came here to the States, all these biographies really stressed me out. And I just remembered wanting to write at one point of my time, Rabea Eghbariah hates this. and that's maybe how I would like to be defined. But seriously, a bit more about me. I was born and raised in Haifa. And I grew up there to a family that originally my mother comes from Akka, and we talked a little bit earlier actually about that. My father comes from Haifa, from al-Fahim, and they moved back to Haifa, which is kind of half circle back because my family was before 1948, before the Nakba, before the mass displacement of Palestinians. For those of our audience who don't know, the Nakba is a catastrophe in Arabic. It resembles a structure of dispossession for Palestinians. It's a process that predates 1948, but is really, resembled by the 1948 dispossession of Palestinians and displacement of more than 700,000 people. My family was one of these people who were displaced from their house, and some of them internally displaced. Others ended up being refugees ousted from historical Palestine. And that background, today I'm learning and reckoning with it more and more, formed who I am. Even when I grew up, I did not maybe know, I was not aware of this impact. But the more I think about it, the more I realize how foundational it is to who I became later on, to this, family fragmentation that I carry with me and with my past. So I grew up in Haifa, which is again a half circle because that's where my family was before 1948. Mm-hmm. But this did not entail any closure, this full circle. And I think that's what I am trying to figure out as a human, to find this closure one day.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
So I want to ask you about being both a human rights attorney and a scholar. So let's talk about your legal work first. Will you tell us what kind of attorney are you? What does it mean to be a human rights attorney in the context of living in Haifa, working with Adela? What are some of the more meaningful cases, more meaningful to you, cases that you have argued?
Yeah, that's, well, I think, there is no one answer to what is being a human rights attorney in this context, right? It's a position where you're always grappling with with questions of, should you be a human rights attorney in this context? At least for me, it's a question of how do you carry out your job in a system of unjust policies, of fundamental injustice, and are your practices eventually legitimating that system by engaging with it? So this is a fundamental tension that I think most human rights lawyers carry. Now, being a lawyer with Adala, I started actually my lawyering career as a public defender.
Where?
In the public defender system, and I was in the Supreme Court cases department, which handled criminal appeals basically, and some of my cases were Palestinian, but not all of them. And some of them I remember, just trying to, or exposure to the human rights work from a incarceration kind of perspective. And I remember I started with appeals that had to do, some of them with juveniles and minors in Jerusalem, and entrapment policies that happened in occupied Jerusalem. Mostly we used to fail, and this is still the case. We are proud losers in a system of, again, fundamental injustice. And then I moved to Adala and Adala is a different type of lawyering. It's a cause lawyering. You're not representing necessarily one particular client. The questions are different. The type of engagement with the cases is different. And I remember first joining Adala, and my very first case that I was really passionate about, I think, was the Za'atar case, which is something that I kind of wanted to work on, the decriminalization of Za'atar and Aqub, the foraging of Za'atar and Aqub, and we can talk more about that. But on a more litigation note, perhaps, I started working on a few petitions to the Supreme Court, coming from that background of the public defender and criminal justice system. I worked in one of my first petition, I believe, was about the so-called security prisoners, and there was a law back at the time that was recently enacted that basically discriminated in the something called the administrative detention system, which is the capacity of prisons to have certain number of prisoners, and there was a system that allowed administrative, not detention, administrative release. So it's kind of an administrative decision to release certain prisoners based on capacity. Yeah, I think we need to pause.
So we got interrupted for just a moment, but you were talking about which cases were meaningful to you and starting your work at Adala. Yeah, so as I said, I think I started with this passion about the Za'atar case. That's the first thing that I really wanted to do. And we can talk a bit more about that if you want. But then I started also filing some petitions. And coming from that background of criminal justice system, I started working on prisoners' rights, particularly, of course, the so-called security prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners that are designated as security prisoners under the Israeli prison system. So we filed a petition back the first few months that I worked with Adala against a law that discriminated against Palestinian prisoners in the release. It's called the administrative release system. And from there, I remember going on to work on one of my favorite cases was also the cyber unit case, which was a case that involved a lot of new material, which was not perhaps the first thing you think of when you talk about Israeli policies, right? Like the censorship of online speech was relatively new at the time with the social media companies, and this whole idea of censoring Palestinian voices online was not as visible as it is today. The knowledge about it was not as common as it is today. Today, it's kind of clear that it's happening, that there is certain also cooperation between these third companies or platforms like Facebook, etc., and also the Israeli government. Back at the time, it was a little bit less transparent or less knowledge
was visible or public about it, and we started working about this unit that was back then relatively recently established in the Israeli prosecutor office that cooperated or submitted requests that are non-binding, informal requests to Facebook, among other platforms, to take down content that it deemed either illegal or basically violating Facebook's own terms of service, or so-called community standard. So we took that also to court, and I think it was very interesting case, which we also lost. But that's fun. As I said, I mean, we're proud losers. In Israeli courts, it's a position I'm happy to occupy.
Before we move on to your scholarship, give us a couple of words on the Zatar case.
Sure. Well, the Zatar case, for those who don't know, for me, it started as a research project when I was in law school. And I basically put the word Zatar in the legal databases, and these decisions of people who were criminalized for foraging Zatar or possessing Zatar even. The law, basically, Israeli nature protection laws criminalize either possession, trade, or picking of Zatar, Akub, and sage, Maramiya, which are 3 Palestinian cuisine plants. And the criminalization comes under the pretext of nature protection, although these plants are not endangered, and there is no scientific corpus that suggests that the criminalization should take that form, at least, you know, or that the regulation should take a form of severe absolute criminalization. So once I started digging into that phenomenon, trying to understand what's going on here, it very quickly for me became evident that this is about, you know, that it's reflective of colonial and settler colonial logic, where the colonizer is coming with this logic to educate the native about, you know, what is nature, what is considered culture, you know, what is considered harmful culture, which is native culture, and how should we protect, preserve nature by basically distancing it from the native. And this is a phenomenon that happens across different settings of settler colonialism. And it just became for me very evident that the story of taking these people to court, criminalizing mostly elderly, but not only elderly people, was a story that was a microcosm of the Nakba, right? It's a microcosm of the Palestinian who loses all his, or loses control on his everydayness, on his basic acts, or basic relationship to nature, to food, to the land. And that was the story for me. You know, it's a story of dispossession. It's also a story of cultural appropriation. It encompasses a lot of dimensions to it. And I think it was fascinating to see that it's all happening under this legitimating force, or double legitimating forces of both law and science, right?
Were there a lot of cases?
Yeah, there were dozens of cases, yes, in the last about 20 years that are published. I collected more than 60 cases, and we're talking about criminal cases. These cases don't include the countless hundreds of fines, on-the-spot fines, that people are subjected to sometimes. And the policy is pretty indiscriminate in the sense that, you know, you don't know when you're getting a fine. There's no coherent logic to when a person gets a fine or when he's brought to court. You know, it does not necessarily mean that people who are brought to court are more severe pickers or cases, right? And it, yeah, or the amounts were necessarily bigger or something like that. But in fact, what I also showed back at the time was that 100% of the defendants were Palestinians. So this was creating, obviously, a desperate impact on Palestinians, and it was tailored to basically criminalize Palestinian culture of fur picking. And so that was the case, that was the background to setting up a challenge. After failing, actually, when I was in the public defender, I worked a little bit on a couple of representing particular clients or defendants in Zatar or Akub, you know, cases, trials. And we failed there most of the time to create any wider, broader change in that
Mhm.
policy.
Mhm.
But then when I joined Adala, we thought we should address this issue more systematically, and we started a legal challenge of the policy that eventually we managed to push the Nature and Parks Authority, who's the body in charge of this,
Mhm.
to reformulate their ban from an absolute ban to a ban that allowed basically a margin of picking, up to 5 kilograms of, abkub and 1.5 kilograms of za'atar in certain areas. Yeah.
For the whole year or per pick?
Per pick,
So
per day, per person.
So you won.
Yeah. yeah. You can say we won.
Yeah.
We won that challenge, absolutely. In the sense that after 40 years of criminalizing za'atar, there was finally change in that policy, in that front. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So now you're doing a doctorate. Here we are sitting together, meeting in person at Harvard, where you're doing a doctorate. What brought you to scholarship? What brought you to academic law? You came here for an LLM. Now you're doing the PhD. Tell us more about what opening these academic doors means for you. Why you decided to do it, and a little bit about what you're focusing on. You're now ABD, all but dissertation.
Yeah.
And so if you would, what are you writing about?
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer what brought me to academia would be also za'atar, because that's how it started. But I was always drawn to, I think, this combination of lawyering and reflection. And I think that academia allows you that space for reflection and writing that sometimes you miss in your professional life as a lawyer, because you're drawing in the details and the cases, and sometimes you need that space. So that for me it was clear that I'm going to combine these two aspects, and I found this place to be the right place, the place that worked eventually also for me. So I came here to do my master's first, which I also did on a topic completely different than I'm working now on. I did it on goats and camels, on policies pertaining to and laws pertaining to the Black Goat Act, for example, which was another law that criminalized grazing of Palestinians, grazing of goats, and also camels in certain areas. So it was another extension, I think, of these policies that pertain, for example, the za'atar is one manifestation, but the idea, again, behind all of these policies is to disconnect Palestinians from their land through different mediums, right? One manifestation is za'atar, another manifestation is the goat, a third perhaps is, camels or other animals, or but you just realize that this logic of the Nakba manifests itself in many different instances, almost in every thinkable story, perhaps, that pertains to the relationship between Palestinian land and where the state kicks in to regulate, police that area. From there, I continued to my SJD, which is the doctorate in law program at the school, and now I'm looking at fragmentation of Palestinians, legal fragmentation of Palestinians.
Say more.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I'm trying to figure out. But the idea,
talking to us about the fragmentation of your family.
Exactly.
Now you're working on legal fragmentation. So
that's true.
Please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The idea of legal fragmentation is basically that today the reality of Palestinians is fragmentation, right? We don't have one framework that unites Palestinians, politically, economically, socially, etc. But as you can learn from a story of my family, for example. But more deeply, I think this structure of fragmentation is also legal. The idea is that you have Palestinians today living under 5 major legal categories. You have Palestinian citizens of Israel, like myself, who hold citizenship. You have Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. You have Palestinian residents of the West Bank. You have Palestinian residents of Gaza. These are 4 distinct categories, although they are all, in some way, shape, or form, are governed by Israel. And this stratification of Palestinians and their classification, continued classification under this regime, is a phenomenon that I call legal fragmentation. While at the same time you have Jewish Israelis who hold or who occupy singular legal status, regardless of territorial division. So you can be a settler in the West Bank and hold the same rights, and are subject to the same civil Israeli legal system as a person who lives in Tel Aviv or Haifa, or it doesn't matter, right? While Palestinians who occupy these distinctive geographies hold different legal statuses usually. And obviously the fifth category would be people who are refugees or diasporic communities who are excluded from this regime, right? And are defined by their exclusion, by this legal exclusion. So this is the phenomenon of legal fragmentation that I'm trying to look at or theorize and develop. And part of it, or an essential part of it, is the idea that there is no legal mobility between these classes or tiers of legal fragmentation. So mostly a resident of Gaza can't become a resident of the West Bank, or a resident of the West Bank can't just suddenly decide to become or upgrade his status to a citizen or a resident of Jerusalem. So this is central, and basically the only mobility you have is downward mobility. Just recently, we have this law that expanded the ability of the government, the Israeli government, to revoke citizenship of Palestinian citizens and even deport them.
Last week.
Yeah, just last week. It's an expansion of an already existing law that the Supreme Court also, upheld. There's a youth case, which was a Adala case as well. And yes, so this is the regime of legal fragmentation that I'm trying to articulate, to look at, to examine and understand.
How interesting. So the fragmentation, the absence of mobility is the defining feature, the absence of upward mobility, and only the presence of downward mobility is the defining feature, as you're describing it.
When you put it that way, I'm inclined to say yes. But I'm just joking about the life of a PhD student. Yes, I think it's a crucial part of it. I don't think it's the only defining feature. I think there is the nexus that differentiate between the legal fragments is first is a shifting nexus, but also it's also about the political community, the mobility in general, the movement rights that a person has. For example, movement is a very clear domain where this fragmentation is manifested, right?
Mobility as in a body moving through space, not movement. Can you move among classes, but can I go from point A to point B?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what identity IDs do you have? Right. What passport do you have?
Right.
I am eligible for an Israeli passport because I'm a Palestinian citizen, right? Yes. But a Palestinian from East Jerusalem is not eligible for an Israeli passport. He's only eligible, for example, for a laissez-passer travel document. And this comes with the different set of restrictions about mobility from and to the world, but also mobility within Palestine, Israel, right? There's different tiers of mobility. A person from Gaza cannot essentially go out of Gaza unless he qualifies to the very strict standards of the humanitarian exceptions for the permits. A person from the West Bank is subject to the military permit regime, and these are different manifestation of fragmentation, where bodies are regulated by a single regime that creates different policies for different people based on your legal classification. So definitely this corresponds with territory, with ID cards, with other sets of rights that you may have, but also essentially with the political community that is drawn and imposed around you.
Right.
And the political community that you are allowed to participate in. So for example, Palestinian citizens, they are in some sort of forcibly incorporated into the Israeli body politic, but they're conditioned to participate in it, right? It's not full participation. It's not full political participation. There's conditions. It's highly policed, but at the same time, they're not allowed, or if you as a Palestinian citizen, as a citizen of Israel, you cannot freely, for example, consider and participate politics, or to imagine yourself as part of the broader Palestinian community.
Mhm.
And
Broader Palestinian community, meaning spanning all of the fragmented areas.
exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. And this, I mean, this is again a legal issue because, for example, when Palestinians from Jerusalem
Mhm.
decided to run to election in the West Bank,
Mhm.
this was a problem legally.
Mhm.
And so you see how the legal system is, maintaining these differences and trying to maintain these divisions, this fragmentation.
Mhm.
And so I think there is, I'm not committed to a definitive set of, I think the nexus is always shifting, but
Mhm.
I think movement is a huge part of it.
Mhm.
Political community is a huge part of it, and other sets of rights, family.
I was wondering if
Yeah.
you were thinking if that was, I know it's a part of the legal definition, and of course, Adela is central in fighting against the family unification.
Yeah.
Disunification, reunification laws that prevent Palestinians who have citizenship from extending that citizenship or the protection of residency to a spouse who is not already a citizen.
Absolutely. So basically, if we want to think about it in terms of fragmentation, right, we have these 4 classes, and the 5th, as we said, is a refugee/diasporic community class,
Mhm.
right? But within historic Palestine, you now have Palestinians classified into these 4 classes, and the upper 2 classes legally
Mhm.
are the citizens and the residents who have a little bit more privilege, legal privilege.
Right.
Again, this does not correspond with economic privilege necessarily or
Mhm.
with class.
Mhm.
But legal privilege is different in the sense that you have citizens, you have residents, and then there is a line drawn there where these classes cannot extend their legal status to their partners
Right.
from the other class, which is West Bank and Gaza.
Mhm.
And even within these two, between the West Bank and Gaza, post 2007, it's very, very, very hard to marry and extend your legal
Mhm.
status. So it is part of, obviously, of the regime of your family, who you can even establish a life with.
Yeah.
Who is an eligible love story.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. I look forward to continuing to learn from you as you continue to learn and establish this particular body of knowledge in your writing. So this part of the conversation will continue, I hope.
Of course. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you to talk to us a little bit about, you just set us up about the stratification and these and this form of legal fragmentation of Palestinians. I want to ask to maybe even, I don't know, step back one step further. Talk to us about this moment in time overall for Palestinians. What does it mean? Where are we in the history of Palestine or Palestinians? Talk to us about where we are in the history of Palestine and in the history of Palestinians. And you've talked a little bit about the importance of 1948 for you personally, for Palestinians overall, but also I know that 2021, the Intifada, the Unity Intifada of 2021 is particularly meaningful for you too. So will you tell us more about Palestinians now?
Yeah. It's going to be more of an improvised answer, to be honest, because I'm not committed to the train of thoughts that I will be having, but let's do it.
Let's do it.
So I think, as we talked about fragmentation, right? And I think Palestinians today are existing in a very severe form of fragmentation, but also unity, right? So it's not, fragmentation is not a static and only force that is there, but also there is an imagined unity that keeps manifesting itself, right? So every generation of Palestinians since 1948 have displayed this unity in different forms, right? It's displayed throughout 1976, perhaps, very forcefully, the Land Day of Palestinian citizens. Also, it's displayed in different forms during the first Intifada, the second Intifada, and then, our generation had the 2021 moment. I think that is very important to understanding where we are today, because I think it really reshaped a whole generation's identity or consciousness about Palestinians. And, you know, in Palestine, at least, it was a very powerful moment for Palestinians. And I think we don't understand, you know, the ramifications or the consequences of that moment yet.
Mm-hmm.
But it is definitely this, again, tension between both fragmentation, material fragmentation, and imagined unity,
Mm-hmm.
and this commitment to this idea of unity, right? For something even to be fragmented, you need some imagination of a unit to start fragmenting, right? And so that imagination is very much alive and kicking among Palestinians today, especially the younger Palestinians. And it ties to the whole question of, you know, nationalism, what it means to have these national aspirations, especially at a time where it's weird, kind of from a leftist perspective, to talk about nationalism so favorably, right? But still, in this colonial context that we live in Palestine, I think this resolution haven't come to an end, and it's kind of unique in that sense. So I do think that today we stand in a point where the question of fragmentation is very much present, is very much important. And the question of how do we undo that will continue to accompany us from now on. And it will keep manifesting itself, you know, in many different ways. It is a situation in general, you know, of intense domination that I believe cannot be eternally sustainable. And, you know,
do you believe that, or do you hope that?
I hope, of course. I believe also it cannot be maintained just forever, you know. I want to believe that, at least. Otherwise, you know, you lose hope. But it's a situation of intense domination that needs change, and this change also will bring hard questions for Palestinians themselves. You know, we need to talk to imagining that we will be able to overcome, you know, the domination or the regime that is now imposing that form of domination on Palestinians. Many questions will arise. You know, it's not a process where you just wake up one day and there is a regime fall and everybody's happy, of course, but it's a process that has created a lot of damage along the way, you know, for Palestinians by fragmenting them, for example. And the question of how do we reconcile these things is going to be a hard process.
Great. Well, I'm about to ask you about your time at FMEP at the foundation, but I just hearing you say what you just said, I just want to say, let's do programs on all of that. On these big questions that Palestinians are asking, insofar as this is a good platform to explore them in English with this audience, that is so welcome and would be so powerful. So my question for you then now is really, like, we're so lucky you're going to be with us for 2023 here at FMEP. And what do you want this audience of listeners to know, to think about, to be challenged by? What is your invitation to them?
I think I will say very briefly, and I'm really happy to continue this, you know, explorations with FMEP. It's an exciting opportunity. I want to say, you know, it's a moment where I feel Palestinian voices are becoming a little bit more heard. Not enough, but a little bit more. There is a sense of urgency that is floating in certain circles, at least. And I want us to engage in honest and deep, you know, conversations about these subjects, because otherwise we cannot push for the change to happen on the ground. And I really think that we need these conversations, not only conversations, we need a change before the conversations, maybe. You know, there is a desperate need for a change on the ground. Because this regime of domination is simply cruel. And I think we should be, as people who are interested in this subject or the audience, I hope, that I can bring with me a voice that will clarify or elucidate certain angles. And that will help us push for a better change.
I hope so too. And I'm grateful to be in partnership with you.
Me too. Thank you, sir.
On this process. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for trusting us with these conversations. And I agree with you that there's a new urgency, it feels like. And also, I truly hope that Palestinians are being more heard now. And FMEP is trying to be a part of that shift, which is why we have this Palestinian Fellowship. And this is our second year of it. And you and Yara Asi will be our fellows this year, and leading us in programs and conversations and inviting guests and helping us to think about things that we need to be thinking about, all of us together. And so that's our charge. That's what we're going to be doing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank also all of our listeners for tuning in today. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. I want to remind you, come to our website, www.fmep.org. For resources related to this podcast, we'll have a link to Rabea's newest article, the one he published just now last week, I think, with Nora Erekat on Jadaliyya. It's called The Jurisprudence of Death, Palestinian Corpses and the Israeli Legal Process. It's an excellent article. We'll have other links of Rabea's work up. And make sure that you subscribe to this podcast so you can stay up to date with Rabea's programs, with Yara's programs, with all of the other FMEP programs. And we publish research every week. You can find us on our website. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. You can also watch video versions of our podcasts, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Sarah Ann Minkin, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts. Thank you for joining us.